Here's the deal. The FDA's rules were pretty consistent and pretty stable for 20 plus years until suddenly the Dobbs decision appeared on the horizon. And when that happened, all of a sudden, we got massive changes in the dispensing requirements of this drug. And I'll just point out that over 60% of abortions in the United States are now carried out with chemical drugs, with these drugs. They're not done in clinics, they're not done in hospitals. They're done with these drugs without any kind of physician supervision, without any physicians there if there's a serious adverse event. Thank you very much, Senator. Doctor, it's great to see you again. I enjoyed our conversation.
Good to see you.
Congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you.
Thank you for your willingness to take on this very important role. You've been asked about this several times already, but I just want to drill down a little bit further. In 2000, President Clinton's FDA approved a chemical abortion regimen with the drugs mifepristone and also misoprostol. Now, the FDA concluded that mifepristone could not be safely used. I'm quoting the FDA there. Safely used, could not be, without special measures. It's the FDA's language. And in particular, the FDA mandated that prescribers needed to be licensed physicians who were able to diagnose and treat ectopic pregnancies to accurately determine the gestational age of the baby. And the FDA further required that these drugs be administered and dispensed in person, that there be a day 1 in-person administration of the drug, a day 3 in-person administration of the second wave of the drug, a day 14 check-in for complications. And the FDA further emphasized that given the potential risks of these drugs, physicians needed to be able to provide ongoing care. The FDA also said, and I'm quoting now, the percentage of women who considered any particular adverse event as severe ranged from 2 to 35%, end quote. And the FDA included what's called a black box warning, which you're very familiar with, which remains on the drug. Now, those restrictions were largely in place until just a couple of years ago, when the Biden administration, after the United States Supreme Court took up the Dobbs decision, granted cert on it, at that point, the Biden administration decided to eliminate 20 years of in-person dispensing requirements for this drug. They didn't cite any studies that they said were adequate. In fact, the FDA acknowledged that the studies that they looked at did not take into account the new protocols that they were issuing. They just eliminated 2 decades of in-person dispensing requirements. My question to you is, given the FDA's own findings on this drug over 2 decades, doesn't it make sense that the FDA return to the pre-political, before the political intervention of the Biden administration, the pre-political protocol that requires in-person dispensing for chemical abortion drugs?
Senator, I appreciated our conversation prior to this hearing. I do think it makes sense to review the totality of data and ongoing data. I know personally of OB doctors who prefer to insist, even though they have the option to prescribe otherwise, but they choose to insist that mifepristone be taken when necessary in their office as they observe the person taking it. And I think their concern there is that if this drug is in the wrong hands, it could be used for coercion.
And of course, you're familiar with the fact that now it's not merely that there's no requirement that it be ingested in the presence of a physician. There's no in-person dispensing requirement whatsoever. This is what the Biden administration, 2 decades of in-person dispensing requirements, the Biden administration eliminated those. Now, you've said several times you'll review the data. You're aware that in 2016, the Obama FDA eliminated the requirement that physicians report adverse events with regard to mifepristone. Aren't you?
I believe they limited the data required to fatalities, but not adverse events.
Will you put back in place the full reporting requirements so that you can have a full range of data to evaluate?
Senator, I'm happy to look at that. I do believe in data, and I don't believe in prejudging data before somebody has taken a look at data, including future data.
Well, let me just say that here's the deal. The FDA's rules were pretty consistent and pretty stable for 20 plus years until suddenly the Dobbs decision appeared on the horizon. And when that happened, all of a sudden, we got massive changes in the dispensing requirements of this drug. And I'll just point out that over 60% of abortions in the United States are now carried out with chemical drugs, with these drugs. They're not done in clinics, they're not done in hospitals. They're done with these drugs without any kind of physician supervision, without any physicians there if there's a serious adverse event. And I'll also just point out that if the Biden rules are allowed to stand, it doesn't matter what voters in the states, it doesn't matter what, this is a serious and very difficult moral issue, the case of life and abortion. And it won't matter what voters in the states say, because the Biden rules say now that bureaucrats can mail in abortion drugs to every single state, no in-person dispensing required. It doesn't matter what voters in the state have decided on the issue. It doesn't matter whatsoever. Now, if that's allowed to stand, we may as well just go back to having the Supreme Court make all the decisions, because right now Washington bureaucrats are making all the decisions. Doctors are not involved. They're not in-person dispensing. State voters are not involved. And I just want to register, this is extremely concerning to me. It ought to be concerning to everyone who's concerned about women's safety, and also about what I thought was the position of this administration, which is that it ought to be voters in the states and the relevant to localities that are deciding this decision. So I know you're familiar with this, Doctor.
Thank you.
I appreciate your commitment to the data. I hope that you'll look at the full range of data, and I hope we can count on you to protect women's health and the health of the unborn.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, Senator Kaine, let the record reflect, even though I have the gavel, I'm going to stop right now and turn it over to you. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a nice title for you to have. It's good to be on this committee with you. Thanks for convening this hearing. Let's take a look here at something that Facebook, Meta, whatever, something that they've said, Mark Zuckerberg in particular said, or was reported in 2021, senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured this is Zuckerberg speaking, pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire, expressed a lot of frustration with our teams when we didn't agree. Ultimately, it was our decision whether or not to take the content down. Now, the point that I want to get at, and maybe I'll start with you, Ms. Hemingway, because you and your outlet were a target of a lot of this and were censored left, right, center. You personally were censored. Don't you think that Facebook needs to be held accountable for their role in all of this? I mean, so Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg says, gosh, they were so mean to us, the Biden people, they threatened us, and they did. Biden did. Was that unconstitutional? I think it was. This is why that Supreme Court case that we've been talking about today, the Missouri case, is so significant. But isn't it also true that, as Zuckerberg himself says in this statement, it was their decision, they owned it, and truthfully, Facebook and others have a pattern of censoring long before this, the Hunter Biden laptop story. They gleefully, willfully censored on their own. They have been avid participants in this censorship campaign. Would you agree with that, Ms. Hemingway?
Yes. Mark Zuckerberg, who spent nearly $450 million in the 2020 election to control the outcome there, has recently done a few little things like saying, I was sort of pressured to do this censorship, or, I'll give $1 million to the inauguration committee, as if this in any way makes up for the campaign of censorship that he was engaged in, which was probably valued even more than the money he gave to the election, to censor and silence voices like mine and my publication because we said things on all sorts of topics that were at odds with what he wanted, whether that's the radical trans agenda, how elections should be run, how to respond to the COVID pandemic, all sorts of topics where in a free society you should have free and open debate, and he worked very hard to keep that from happening. So I find these statements kind of interesting, but they nowhere near deal with the agency that he had on this and how much power he has as the head of Facebook.
Yeah, I'm glad you just used the word power, because that's a big part of this story, isn't it? Companies like Facebook, Meta, have enormous structural power that Mark Zuckerberg has spent, to your point, he has spent billions of dollars amassing. He has worked to destroy competitors who might break that power up, challenge that power in any way. He has used that power to stifle competition. He's used it to stifle views he doesn't like. This is a textbook example of what happens when a monopoly that has a political agenda, in this case a very hard-edged political agenda for years, when they use that monopoly in order to try to control other competitors and also to try to control the information that flows to the American people. Do I have that right, do you think?
Yes, and the political system itself, which had previously been so supportive of him, and the work that he did to silence, again, not just in the election sphere, but those journalistic voices that were countering his preferred policy objective.
That's just terrific, and you are perfectly placed to talk about that and to bring this to light. I think it's so vital that we don't lose sight of the role that these massive companies, and there's just a few of them. I mean, it's Google, it's Meta, that the control that they have amassed and that they have used to try and dictate, frankly, what Americans can see. And we know in the case of Google, we've had testimony in this committee and subcommittees before, Google has rigged their search results to try and influence independent voters and try to sway elections for years, and not just in this country. They've done it in other countries. They've done it in Australia. These are massive monopoly corporations that have political agendas that have been using their market power to try and influence. Actually, that's not strong enough, to try and control outcomes in our political system. That is a problem. And I would just submit, until we deal with their power, this problem is going to persist. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this great hearing.